The courtroom was silent save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic tapping of a pen against the judge's desk. Everyone in the room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. At the center of it all stood Kash Patel, a man whose name had become synonymous with controversy over the past few months. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the storm brewing around him. The judge, an imposing figure with sharp features and piercing eyes, leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Mr. Patel," she said, her tone firm and unyielding, "you are ordered to reveal your sources immediately. Failure to comply will result in serious consequences." Her words hung in the air, heavy with authority. Kash didn't move right away. Instead, he stood there, his posture relaxed but his mind racing. He had known this moment might come, but nothing could fully prepare him for the weight of the situation. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his leather briefcase, pulling out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't just any document. It was a declassified memo, its edges slightly worn from being handled so many times. As Kash held the memo up for everyone to see, the room erupted into murmurs. People craned their necks trying to catch a glimpse of the paper that had suddenly become the focal point of the entire trial. What made the moment even more surreal was the fact that the judge's own name was printed boldly on the top corner of the document. For a brief second, the judge froze, her expression unreadable. Was it shock? Anger? Or perhaps something else entirely? Whatever it was, Kash seized the opportunity to speak, his voice steady and measured. "I understand the gravity of your request, Your Honor," Kash began, addressing the judge directly. "But before I proceed, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. This memo is not just a piece of paper. It represents years of painstaking work, countless sleepless nights, and the courage of individuals who risked everything to bring the truth to light." His words resonated through the courtroom, capturing the attention of everyone present. Even the bailiff, who had been standing stoically by the door, seemed momentarily transfixed. Kash went on to explain how he had spent months piecing together fragments of information, connecting dots that others had either missed or chosen to ignore. The memo in his hand was part of a larger puzzle, one that exposed corruption at levels most people couldn't even imagine. He described how whistleblowers, ordinary people working within the system, had come forward, trusting him with secrets they knew could cost them their careers, their freedom, or even their lives. These were not reckless individuals seeking fame or fortune. They were patriots driven by a desire to hold those in power accountable. The judge listened intently, her expression softening ever so slightly. But Kash wasn't done yet. He painted a vivid picture of the challenges he had faced along the way. There were moments when he questioned whether the fight was worth it, whether the sacrifices were too great. Late-night meetings in dimly lit parking lots, encrypted messages sent from burner phones, and constant paranoia about being followed or monitored. These were just some of the realities Kash had lived with every day. Yet despite the risks, he pressed on, driven by a belief that the truth deserved to be heard. One particular story stood out as Kash recounted his journey. It involved a whistleblower named Elena, a mid-level analyst who had stumbled upon evidence of illegal activities while reviewing classified documents. Terrified but determined, she reached out to Kash under the cover of darkness, meeting him in an empty warehouse on the outskirts of town. That night, she handed over a flash drive containing files that would later form the backbone of Kash's case. Elena's hands trembled as she passed the drive to him, her eyes filled with fear and hope. "Please," she had whispered, "make sure this doesn't go to waste." Kash remembered the weight of that moment, the realization that he now carried, not only Elena's trust but also the burden of exposing wrongdoing on a massive scale. From that point onward, his life changed completely. Sleep became a luxury he could rarely afford, and every decision he made was weighed against the potential fallout. Friends distanced themselves, fearing association with someone embroiled in such high-stakes drama. Critics labeled him reckless, accusing him of playing politics or seeking personal gain. But none of that mattered to Kash. What mattered was ensuring that the truth saw the light of day no matter the cost. Back in the courtroom, Kash paused briefly, allowing his words to sink in. He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of spectators who had gathered to witness this historic confrontation. Some looked skeptical, others intrigued, and a few appeared genuinely moved by his account. Then, turning back to the judge, Kash concluded his opening remarks with a simple yet powerful statement. "Your Honor, I am not here to defy the law. I am here to uphold it. And if revealing my sources means jeopardizing the very principles I'm fighting for, then I must respectfully decline your order." The silence that followed was deafening. The judge sat motionless, her gaze locked onto Kash as though trying to decipher the man behind the words. For Kash, the stakes had never been higher. He knew that whatever decision the judge made next would have far-reaching implications, not just for him personally, but for the future of transparency and accountability in government. As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Yet Kash remained composed, his resolve unwavering. Whatever happened next, he was ready. Unbeknownst to anyone in the courtroom, this was only the beginning of a much larger story. Behind the scenes, forces were already mobilizing, preparing for the inevitable fallout from today's events. Allies and enemies alike were watching closely, waiting to see how Kash Patel would navigate the treacherous waters ahead. For now, though, the spotlight remained firmly on him. A man standing alone against a system that often valued secrecy over justice. Little did anyone know the revelations contained in that declassified memo, and the courage of those who dared to speak out, would soon send shockwaves through the nation, challenging everything people thought they knew about power, integrity, and the pursuit of truth. As the courtroom buzzed with anticipation, Kash Patel took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of countless eyes on him, each pair waiting for his next move. The judge's command still lingered in the air, but Kash knew he couldn't simply comply, not without risking everything he had worked so hard to protect. His sources were not just names on a list. They were real people with families, fears, and futures hanging in the balance. To reveal them would be to betray their trust and possibly endanger their lives. Kash began pacing slowly in front of the bench, his movements deliberate yet unhurried. He spoke again, his voice calm but firm, as if addressing not only the judge but also the entire room. "Your Honor," he said, pausing briefly to glance at the memo in his hand, "this document represents more than just evidence. It tells a story of courage, sacrifice, and the lengths ordinary citizens are willing to go to expose corruption." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "These individuals trusted me because they believed I could protect them while bringing the truth to light. If I break that trust now, it won't just harm them. It will silence others who might otherwise step forward." The judge raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. She leaned back slightly in her chair, studying Kash with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Mr. Patel," she replied, her tone measured but edged with authority, "while I appreciate your dedication to protecting these whistleblowers, the law is clear. You cannot operate above it. Justice demands transparency even when it's inconvenient." Her words carried a quiet finality, as though daring Kash to challenge her further. But Kash wasn't backing down. Instead, he launched into another part of his story, one that painted a vivid picture of the risks involved in uncovering the truth. He described how, after receiving Elena's flash drive, he spent weeks meticulously reviewing its contents, cross-referencing documents, and verifying every detail. It wasn't enough to simply have the information. He needed proof that would stand up under scrutiny. Every late night spent combing through files, every encrypted message exchanged in secret, and every paranoid glance over his shoulder had been part of the painstaking process of ensuring accuracy. He recounted how he had sought advice from legal experts, former intelligence officers, and cybersecurity specialists to ensure that no sensitive details would inadvertently put national security at risk. Each step had been taken with extreme caution, knowing full well that any misstep could lead to disaster. "I didn't act recklessly," Kash emphasized, his voice rising slightly with conviction. "I acted responsibly, and I did so because I believe the public has a right to know what's being done in their name." By now, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted noticeably. Some spectators sat on the edge of their seats, completely engrossed in Kash's narrative. Others whispered among themselves, debating whether his actions were justified or reckless. Even the journalists scribbling notes in the back rows seemed unusually focused, sensing that history was unfolding right before their eyes. Kash then shared a moment that struck a chord with everyone present. One evening, while working late in his office, he received a call from Elena. Her voice trembled as she told him she thought she was being followed. Someone had left an anonymous note on her car warning her to stop digging. Fear gripped her, but she refused to back down. "They can try to scare me all they want," she told Kash, her voice shaky but resolute. "But I won't let them win." That conversation stayed with Kash long after they hung up. It reminded him why he had taken on this fight in the first place, to give people like Elena a voice, to ensure their bravery didn't go unnoticed. Returning to the present, Kash looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of following the rules, but sometimes the rules need to bend to accommodate extraordinary circumstances. These whistleblowers didn't come forward for fame or fortune. They came forward because they saw something wrong and felt compelled to act. By forcing me to reveal their identities, you're not just punishing me. You're sending a message to others that speaking out comes with unbearable consequences." The judge listened intently, her expression softening slightly. For a brief moment, Kash thought he saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. But then she straightened in her seat, her demeanor becoming stern once more. "Mr. Patel," she said, her voice firm, "the court must weigh many factors here. While your intentions may be noble, we cannot ignore the potential damage caused by leaking classified material. There is a process for handling such matters, and bypassing it undermines the rule of law." Kash nodded respectfully, acknowledging her point. But instead of retreating, he doubled down. He explained how he had gone to great lengths to minimize any harm. Before releasing any information, he consulted with experts to redact sensitive details that could jeopardize ongoing operations or compromise national security. He stressed that his goal had never been to cause chaos but to spark meaningful change. "If anything," Kash argued, "my actions have strengthened accountability, holding those in power responsible for their decisions." As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew palpable. Spectators exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what would happen next. Would the judge hold firm to her demand? Or would she recognize the moral complexity of Kash's position? Everyone waited anxiously for her ruling, which seemed to hang precariously in the balance. Finally, the judge leaned forward, resting her elbows on the bench. She studied Kash carefully, her gaze piercing but thoughtful. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Mr. Patel," she began, her tone softer now, "you've presented a compelling case. However, the law remains the law. I cannot overlook your refusal to disclose your sources, nor can I condone the unauthorized release of classified material. That said, I am inclined to consider the unique circumstances surrounding this matter." Her words sent a ripple of surprise through the courtroom. Kash exhaled softly, allowing himself a small measure of relief. Though the outcome was still uncertain, it seemed the judge was beginning to see the bigger picture. Perhaps there was hope after all. In the meantime, outside the courthouse, news of the trial spread rapidly. Social media lit up with hashtags supporting Kash Patel, while critics condemned his defiance of authority. Protesters gathered on both sides of the issue, their chants echoing through the streets. Inside the courtroom, however, Kash remained focused, his mind already racing ahead to what might come next. He knew this was far from over, but for now, he had succeeded in keeping the spotlight on the truth. Little did anyone realize, though, that the drama was about to escalate. A key figure connected to the scandal was preparing to make a dramatic entrance, one that would turn the trial and the nation upside down. As Kash stood quietly in the courtroom, unaware of what awaited him, the wheels of fate continued to turn, setting the stage for revelations that would shake the foundations of power itself. The courtroom remained tense, the air thick with anticipation as the judge's words lingered in everyone's minds. Kash Patel stood still, his expression calm but alert, like a chess player waiting for their opponent's next move. The judge had hinted at leniency, acknowledging the moral complexities of the case, but she hadn't yet issued a final ruling. For Kash, this was both a victory and a challenge. He knew the battle wasn't over, it was merely entering a new phase. As the judge paused to review her notes, Kash glanced toward the gallery. Among the sea of faces, he noticed a few familiar ones: friends who had supported him quietly from the sidelines, colleagues who admired his determination, and strangers who seemed drawn to the drama unfolding before them. But there was one person whose presence caught his attention more than anyone else. Sitting near the back of the room was a man in his late 40s, dressed in a plain suit that didn't quite fit. His face was partially hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses, but Kash recognized him immediately. It was Marcus Reed, a former intelligence officer turned whistleblower, whom Kash had worked with months earlier. Marcus's appearance sent a jolt through Kash. They hadn't spoken since their last encrypted message exchange, where Marcus warned Kash about potential fallout if certain documents were made public. At the time, Kash had assured him they'd done everything possible to protect sensitive details. Now, seeing Marcus here in person felt like a sign, a warning, or perhaps an act of solidarity. Kash couldn't be sure which, but he resolved to stay vigilant. Back at the bench, the judge cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention once more. "Mr. Patel," she began, her voice steady but tinged with something akin to hesitation. "I find myself in a difficult position. On one hand, I am bound by the law to demand full transparency regarding your sources. On the other hand, I cannot ignore the broader implications of your actions. Therefore, I will grant you 24 hours to reconsider your stance." She paused briefly, letting her words settle. "In the meantime, I will consult with legal experts to determine whether alternative measures can be taken to address this matter without compromising national security." The room erupted into murmurs again, though not as loudly as before. Some spectators seemed relieved, interpreting the judge's decision as a sign of fairness. Others appeared frustrated, believing Kash should have been forced to comply immediately. Kash himself exhaled slowly, feeling a mix of gratitude and frustration. 24 hours wasn't much time, but it was enough to regroup and strategize. As the session adjourned, Kash gathered his belongings, including the declassified memo that had become central to the trial. Reporters swarmed around him, firing questions rapidly. "Will you reveal your sources? Do you think this is a win for accountability? What's your next step?" Kash offered polite but vague responses, refusing to commit to anything concrete until he had a chance to think things through. Outside the courthouse, the crowd grew larger. Protesters held signs advocating for transparency, while counter-protesters argued for strict adherence to the law. News vans lined the street, their cameras trained on Kash as he emerged from the building. Despite the chaos surrounding him, Kash maintained his composure, walking briskly toward a waiting car. Before he could get inside, however, someone tapped him on the shoulder. Turning around, he saw Marcus standing there, looking uneasy, but determined. "Kash," Marcus said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "We need to talk." Kash nodded, signaling to his driver to wait. Together, they stepped away from the crowd, finding a quiet corner near the courthouse steps. Marcus removed his sunglasses, revealing tired eyes that spoke volumes about the stress he'd endured. "Things are escalating faster than we anticipated," he admitted. "People higher up are getting nervous. They're starting to panic." Kash frowned, sensing the gravity of Marcus's words. "What do you mean? What's happening?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Marcus hesitated for a moment before continuing. "There's talk of retaliation. Not just against you, but against everyone involved. Someone leaked information about Elena's role, and now she's under surveillance. If they connect the dots back to me..." He trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. A chill ran down Kash's spine. He had always known the risks, but hearing it laid out so plainly brought the danger into sharp focus. "We need to protect her," Kash said firmly. "And we need to make sure whatever happens next doesn't put anyone else in harm's way." Marcus nodded grimly. "That's why I'm here. There's another piece of evidence, a document, that ties everything together. It's risky, but if released strategically, it could shift the narrative entirely." Kash listened intently as Marcus explained the nature of the document. It contained emails and transcripts proving direct involvement of high-ranking officials in illegal activities. Unlike previous leaks, this one left no room for denial or deflection. However, releasing it would require careful timing and coordination to minimize collateral damage. Kash understood the stakes, but also recognized the opportunity. This could be the turning point, the moment when justice finally tipped in their favor. "I'll do it," Kash said after a long pause, "but we need to plan carefully. We can't afford any mistakes." Marcus agreed, promising to send the document securely later that evening. As they parted ways, Kash felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was fraught with peril, but he refused to give up. Not now. Not when they were so close to exposing the truth. Later that night, Kash sat alone in his apartment, poring over the newly received document. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he pushed forward, analyzing every detail. He reached out to trusted allies, coordinating efforts to ensure maximum impact while safeguarding those involved. Sleep eluded him as he worked tirelessly, knowing that tomorrow would bring another round of challenges. Unbeknownst to Kash, forces beyond his control were already mobilizing. Powerful figures within the government scrambled to contain the situation, deploying resources to track down the source of the leak. Meanwhile, supporters rallied online, spreading awareness and urging others to stand firm in the face of adversity. The nation watched with bated breath, unsure of what the next day would bring. By morning, the stage was set for a dramatic showdown. Kash arrived at the courthouse early, his mind racing with possibilities. He carried the new document with him, ready to use it if necessary. As he entered the building, he couldn't shake the feeling that today would mark a pivotal moment, not just for him, but for the country as a whole. Inside the courtroom, tensions ran higher than ever. Spectators packed the gallery, eager to witness the outcome. Reporters jotted down notes furiously, speculating about what Kash might say or do. Even the judge seemed unusually somber, her usual sternness tempered by a hint of apprehension. All eyes were on Kash as he took his place at the center of the room, prepared to face whatever came next. Little did anyone know, Kash had one final card to play. A revelation so explosive that it would leave no doubt about the depth of corruption plaguing the system. As the judge called the session to order, Kash steadied himself, ready to deliver the truth in its rawest form. Whatever happened next, he vowed to remain steadfast, knowing that the fight for justice was worth every sacrifice. The courtroom was packed to the brim, a sea of faces leaning forward in anticipation. Every seat was taken, and even the aisles were lined with spectators eager to witness what Kash Patel would do next. The air felt electric, buzzing with whispered conversations and the occasional shuffle of papers. At the center of it all stood Kash, his posture calm but resolute, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. And in many ways, he did. Today was the day he would either solidify his legacy as a champion of truth or face the consequences of defying authority. As the judge entered the room, the murmurs died down instantly, replaced by an almost suffocating silence. She took her seat at the bench, her expression unreadable but commanding. "Mr. Patel," she began, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Have you reconsidered your position regarding the disclosure of your sources?" All eyes turned to Kash, waiting for his response. He didn't hesitate. Stepping forward, slightly, he replied, "Your Honor, I have not changed my stance. However, I am prepared to present evidence that may clarify the necessity of my actions." With that, Kash reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder containing the explosive document Marcus had delivered the night before. He held it up briefly for everyone to see, then placed it carefully on the table in front of him. The gesture alone sent ripples through the room. Some people gasped audibly, while others exchanged nervous glances. Even the judge seemed momentarily unsettled, though she quickly masked her reaction with her usual stoic demeanor. Kash began speaking, his voice steady and clear. "What you are about to hear is not speculation or hearsay. It is undeniable proof of wrongdoing at the highest levels of government." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. Then, opening the folder, he began reading excerpts from the document, emails, transcripts, and internal memos that painted a damning picture of corruption, manipulation, and abuse of power. Names were mentioned, dates were cited, and connections were laid bare for all to see. One email in particular caught everyone's attention. It detailed how certain officials had knowingly authorized illegal activities under the guise of national security. Another transcript revealed a conversation where key players discussed ways to cover up their tracks. Each revelation hit like a thunderclap, leaving the audience stunned. Some spectators covered their mouths in shock, while others scribbled furiously in notebooks trying to capture every detail. Journalists in the back rows typed rapidly on their laptops, racing to get the story out to the public. The judge listened intently, her brow furrowed as she absorbed the magnitude of what was being presented. For Kash, this was the moment he had been building toward. The moment where the truth could no longer be ignored or swept under the rug. But he didn't stop there. Knowing that raw data alone might not fully convey the gravity of the situation, he shared personal stories tied to the evidence. He spoke about Elena, the whistleblower who had risked everything to hand over the initial flash drive. Elena didn't come forward because she wanted fame or fortune, Kash explained. She came forward because she saw something wrong and felt compelled to act. Now, because of her bravery, we know the extent of the rot within our system. He went on to describe how Elena had been living in fear since the leak, constantly looking over her shoulder, unsure if she'd ever feel safe again. Her courage, Kash argued, deserved recognition, not punishment. Then he talked about Marcus, whose presence in the courtroom yesterday had reminded Kash of the human cost of exposing the truth. Marcus left behind a stable career, a comfortable life, and even friendships because he believed in doing the right thing. Kash said, "These aren't reckless individuals, they're patriots who put their faith in me to protect them. If I break that trust now, I'm not just failing them, I'm failing the very principles I claim to stand for." By the time Kash finished speaking, the atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. Gone was the skepticism that had lingered earlier. In its place was a palpable sense of outrage and hope. People began whispering among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding in agreement. Even the judge appeared visibly affected, her usual composure cracking slightly as she processed the enormity of the revelations. Finally, she broke the silence. "Mr. Patel," she said, her tone softer than before, "the information you've presented today is troubling, to say the least. While I cannot condone your methods, I must acknowledge the seriousness of the allegations. This court will need time to review the evidence thoroughly and determine the appropriate course of action." With that, she adjourned the session, instructing both parties to return the following day for further deliberations. As the courtroom emptied, Kash stepped outside, immediately greeted by a swarm of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust into his face, and questions flew at him from every direction. "Is this the smoking gun?" one journalist asked. "How does this impact national security?" another pressed. Kash answered as best he could, keeping his responses concise but impactful. "Today isn't about me," he said firmly. "It's about holding those in power accountable and ensuring justice prevails." Behind the scenes, however, Kash knew the fight was far from over. Powerful figures implicated in the documents were already scrambling to mitigate the damage. Lawyers were drafting statements, spin doctors were crafting narratives, and allies of the accused were working overtime to discredit the evidence. Kash understood that releasing the document wasn't enough. He needed to stay several steps ahead to ensure the truth couldn't be buried. That evening, Kash met with a small group of trusted advisors in a secure location. They pored over the fallout from the day's events, strategizing how to counter any attempts to undermine the credibility of the evidence. One advisor suggested leaking additional details to sympathetic media outlets to keep the pressure on. Another proposed organizing grassroots campaigns to rally public support. Kash listened carefully, weighing each suggestion before making decisions. Meanwhile, outside the confines of strategy meetings, the nation was abuzz with debate. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags supporting Kash and condemning the alleged corruption. Protesters gathered in major cities holding signs that read, "Transparency now and justice over power." Critics, however, weren't silent either. Opponents accused Kash of playing politics, arguing that his actions undermined the rule of law and jeopardized national security. The division was stark, with opinions polarized across the board. Amid the chaos, Kash received a call from Elena. Her voice trembled as she recounted how agents had visited her workplace earlier that day, asking probing questions about her involvement in recent leaks. Though they hadn't outright accused her of anything, the message was clear: she was being watched. Kash assured her that he wouldn't let anyone harm her, promising to take whatever steps necessary to keep her safe. After hanging up, he felt a renewed determination to see this through, not just for himself but for everyone who had placed their trust in him. The next morning, Kash returned to the courthouse, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As he walked through the doors, he noticed an unexpected development. A crowd of supporters had gathered outside, chanting slogans and holding banners in solidarity. Among them were ordinary citizens, activists, and even a few whistleblowers who had come to show their support. For Kash, it was a powerful reminder that he wasn't fighting alone, that countless others believed in the cause and were willing to stand by him. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The judge entered, her expression more serious than ever. Before she could speak, however, a new figure arrived, a high-ranking official who had been named in the leaked documents. Their entrance sent shockwaves through the room, raising questions about what role they would play in the unfolding drama. Kash watched closely, knowing that this twist could either strengthen his case or complicate matters further. As the session resumed, Kash braced himself for another round of arguments and counter-arguments. Whatever happened next, he vowed to remain steadfast, driven by the belief that the pursuit of truth was worth every sacrifice. Little did he know, the climax of this battle was closer than anyone anticipated, and when it arrived, it would change everything. The courtroom was abuzz with murmurs as the high-ranking official entered, flanked by two sharply dressed lawyers. His presence commanded attention, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor as he made his way to a seat reserved for key witnesses. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath, unsure of what this unexpected turn meant. Kash Patel watched closely, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He knew this man well, or at least he knew the name and reputation that preceded him. This was someone who had operated in the shadows for years, pulling strings without ever stepping into the spotlight. Until now. The judge called the session to order, her voice firm but tinged with an edge of unease. "This court has been presented with extraordinary claims," she began, addressing the room. "Today we will hear testimony from individuals directly implicated in these allegations. Let us proceed with clarity and fairness." With that, she turned to the official seated near the front. "You may take the stand." As the man rose and walked toward the witness box, Kash felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the moment he had prepared for, the chance to confront one of the architects of the corruption he had exposed. The official swore an oath, his expression calm but guarded, as if he were already rehearsing his defense. Once settled, he introduced himself to the court, speaking in a smooth, confident tone that suggested years of practice delivering speeches and dodging questions. Kash listened intently as the official began recounting his version of events. According to him, the documents Kash had presented were taken out of context, misinterpreted, or outright fabricated. "These so-called revelations," he said dismissively, gesturing toward the folder on the table, "are nothing more than a smear campaign designed to tarnish reputations and destabilize our institutions." His words were calculated, aimed at sowing doubt among those listening. Some spectators nodded along, while others exchanged skeptical glances. When it came time for cross-examination, Kash approached the podium, his demeanor calm but commanding. He started with simple questions, allowing the official to grow comfortable before diving deeper. "Sir," Kash began, his voice steady, "you claim these documents are misleading. Can you explain why your email address appears repeatedly in communications, discussing illegal activities?" The official hesitated for a fraction of a second but quickly recovered, offering a vague explanation about administrative oversight. Kash pressed further, asking pointed questions that forced the man to backtrack and contradict himself. One exchange stood out above the rest. Kash held up a printed copy of a transcript, pointing to a specific line where the official had explicitly authorized an action that violated federal law. "Is this not your signature here?" Kash asked, his tone deceptively casual. The official hesitated again, visibly uncomfortable under Kash's unwavering gaze. "That document has been altered," he finally stammered, though his voice lacked conviction. Spectators leaned forward, sensing the tide turning. Even the judge raised an eyebrow, jotting down notes as Kash continued dismantling the official's defenses. Outside the courtroom, news of the confrontation spread like wildfire. Social media erupted with reactions, hashtags trending globally as people weighed in on the unfolding drama. Supporters praised Kash for his persistence, calling him a hero for standing up to entrenched power. Critics doubled down on their accusations, labeling him reckless and dangerous. But regardless of which side they supported, everyone agreed on one thing: the stakes had never been higher. Back inside, the tension reached a boiling point when Kash introduced another piece of evidence, a video recording secretly captured during a closed-door meeting. In the footage, the same official could be seen discussing plans to suppress whistleblowers and discredit anyone who dared speak out. The audio was clear, the visuals undeniable. When the clip played on a screen set up in the courtroom, gasps rippled through the audience. The official's face flushed red, his composure cracking for the first time. Kash seized the opportunity, addressing the judge directly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "this is not just about me or my sources. It's about accountability. These actions represent a betrayal of public trust, a violation of the principles we claim to uphold. If we allow such behavior to go unchecked, what message does that send? That power absolves wrongdoing. That truth is unnegotiable." The judge sat silently for several moments, her pen poised over her notepad. Finally, she spoke, her tone measured but resolute. "Mr. Patel, the evidence you have presented today raises serious concerns that cannot be ignored. However, due process must still be followed. I am ordering an independent investigation into these allegations, led by a panel unaffiliated with any party involved in this case. Until then, all parties are instructed to refrain from further commentary that could prejudice the inquiry." Though not the outright victory Kash had hoped for, the ruling marked a significant step forward. As the session adjourned, reporters swarmed around him once again, eager for quotes and sound bites. Kash kept his responses brief, focusing on gratitude for the support he'd received and reiterating his commitment to seeing justice served. Behind the scenes, however, he remained vigilant. He knew the fight wasn't over. Powerful forces would stop at nothing to protect themselves. That evening, Kash met with Elena and Marcus in a secure location. Both looked exhausted but determined. They discussed the fallout from the day's events, strategizing how to keep the momentum going while ensuring their safety. Kash reassured them that they weren't alone, that thousands of people across the country were rallying behind their cause. Together, they reviewed additional documents and recordings, preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. Meanwhile, outside the walls of strategy meetings, the nation grappled with the implications of what had been revealed. Protesters took to the streets in record numbers, demanding accountability and transparency. Politicians issued statements condemning the alleged corruption, though many carefully avoided taking sides. Late-night talk shows joked about the scandal, while news anchors debated its long-term impact. For better or worse, Kash Patel's name dominated headlines worldwide. As days turned into weeks, the independent investigation unfolded methodically. Investigators interviewed whistleblowers, subpoenaed records, and analyzed data with painstaking precision. Kash cooperated fully, providing access to everything he had gathered while continuing to advocate for systemic change. Though threats persisted, both subtle and overt, he refused to back down, driven by the belief that exposing the truth was worth the risk. Then, just as the investigation neared its conclusion, a bombshell dropped. Investigators uncovered evidence, implicating not only the original official, but also several others in a sprawling web of misconduct. Leaks suggested that resignations and indictments were imminent. Public outrage reached new heights, fueled by demands for sweeping reforms. Kash watched it all unfold, knowing that the sacrifices made by so many were finally bearing fruit. On the final day of the trial, Kash stood before the judge one last time. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The judge delivered her verdict, acknowledging the gravity of the situation and commending Kash for his role in bringing the truth to light. While she emphasized the importance of adhering to legal protocols, she also acknowledged the moral imperative to act when faced with injustice. As Kash left the courthouse surrounded by supporters chanting his name, he felt a mix of relief and resolve. The battle had been won, but the war for transparency and accountability was far from over. Little did he know, however, that this victory would inspire countless others to follow in his footsteps, to challenge corruption wherever it lurked, and to fight tirelessly for a better, fairer world. And though the road ahead promised to be difficult, Kash Patel walked it with unwavering determination, ready to face whatever came next. The final verdict echoed through the courtroom, leaving a profound silence in its wake. Kash Patel stood motionless for a moment, absorbing the weight of what had just been said. The judge's words, acknowledging both the rule of law and the moral necessity of exposing corruption, felt like a hard-fought compromise. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to signal a turning point. Slowly, Kash turned to face the gallery, his eyes scanning the sea of faces. There were tears in some eyes, smiles on others, and nods of approval from those who had believed in him all along. As he stepped out of the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers. Supporters chanted his name, held up signs praising transparency, and clapped rhythmically as if celebrating a hero returning home after a long battle. For Kash, though, it wasn't about glory. He walked through the throng of people with humility, shaking hands and offering quiet thanks to those who approached him. His heart swelled not because of the adulation, but because he knew that this fight was bigger than him. It belonged to everyone who had dared to challenge power. Later that evening, Kash met with Elena and Marcus in a quiet cafe tucked away from the chaos. They sat at a corner table, sipping coffee and reflecting on everything they had endured together. Elena looked visibly relieved, her shoulders less tense than they had been in months. "We did it," she whispered, almost unable to believe it herself. Marcus nodded, adding, "But don't think this is the end. People are watching now. If we let our guard down, they'll try to sweep it under the rug again," Kash agreed. While the trial had brought significant attention to the issue, he knew the real work lay ahead, ensuring that reforms stuck, holding those responsible accountable, and protecting whistleblowers from retaliation. He promised them, and himself, that he wouldn't stop fighting until meaningful change took root. Together they discussed next steps, brainstorming ways to keep public pressure alive and push for legislative safeguards to protect future truth-tellers. Outside the cafe, the streets buzzed with energy. Protesters remained camped outside government buildings, refusing to disperse until promises of reform materialized into action. News outlets continued their coverage, dissecting every detail of the scandal while speculating about its long-term impact. Social media was flooded with messages of hope and calls for vigilance. Ordinary citizens, inspired by Kash's courage, began organizing grassroots movements to demand greater accountability in their communities. What started as one man's crusade had ignited a nationwide awakening. In the days that followed, the fallout became impossible to ignore. High-ranking officials implicated in the investigation resigned or were removed from their positions. Congressional hearings were scheduled to address systemic flaws within government agencies. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at strengthening whistleblower protections and increasing transparency. Critics accused these efforts of being performative, but supporters argued that even small victories mattered. They were stepping stones toward lasting change. For Kash, life didn't return to normal. If anything, it grew busier. Invitations poured in from universities, civic organizations, and advocacy groups eager to hear him speak. He traveled across the country, sharing his story and urging audiences to remain engaged in the political process. At each stop, he emphasized the importance of ordinary people standing up against injustice. Change doesn't come from waiting for someone else to fix things, he often said. It comes from you, the teachers, the workers, the parents, the students. You have more power than you realize. Behind the scenes, however, challenges persisted. Powerful figures still sought to undermine the progress made during the trial. Anonymous threats arrived regularly, targeting not only Kash but also those closest to him. Security measures tightened around Elena and Marcus, who had become symbols of bravery in their own right. Kash worked tirelessly to shield them from harm, enlisting legal teams and cybersecurity experts to safeguard their identities and livelihoods. Despite the risks, Kash found solace in the growing network of allies who joined the cause. Former whistleblowers reached out, offering advice and support. Journalists committed to uncovering hidden truths partnered with him to shine light on new cases of misconduct. Even politicians, once hesitant to take sides, began championing transparency initiatives, citing the trial as proof of the urgent need for reform. Months later, Kash attended a ceremony honoring whistleblowers at a national monument. Standing beneath the towering structure, surrounded by individuals who had risked everything to expose wrongdoing, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. As he delivered a speech, his voice carried emotion. "Today isn't about me," he said, looking out at the audience. "It's about all of you, for your courage, your resilience, and your refusal to stay silent when it mattered most. Because of you, we've taken a step closer to justice." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing off the marble walls. But Kash knew better than to rest on his laurels. Walking away from the podium, he exchanged knowing glances with Elena and Marcus, who stood nearby. Their journey wasn't over. It never truly would be. Corruption was a persistent foe, one that required constant vigilance to combat. But for now, they allowed themselves a rare moment of peace, basking in the knowledge that they had sparked something extraordinary. Back home, Kash spent evenings poring over new cases, mentoring aspiring activists and writing letters to policymakers advocating for stronger protections. He understood that revolutions weren't won overnight. They were built brick by brick, decision by decision. And so, he dedicated himself to laying the groundwork for a brighter future, one where truth prevailed over secrecy and justice triumphed over impunity. Years later, historians would look back on the trial as a pivotal moment, a catalyst for change that reshaped how society viewed accountability and governance. Textbooks featured Kash Patel's name alongside other trailblazers who had fought for integrity in the face of adversity. Yet for Kash, the legacy wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about proving that even in the darkest times, ordinary people could rise up and make a difference. As he sat on his porch one quiet evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Kash reflected on the road traveled. The scars of the past lingered, the sleepless nights, the threats, the sacrifices, but they were outweighed by the victories achieved. Somewhere in the distance, children played in the park, their laughter floating on the breeze. Kash smiled faintly, reminded that the world he fought for was worth every struggle. And though the battle for truth and justice would continue long, after he was gone, Kash Patel rested easy knowing he had done his part. He had lit a fire, one that no amount of fear or intimidation could extinguish,